Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Today's album review is on Moon Safari by Air from 1998. Originally it was released on Astroworks Records, and Air is a French band. Two members make up this band, and this was their debut album from 1998. And when it came out, it was in some ways it was fairly revolutionary. It was definitely unique in a lot of ways, and I'll probably talk about that on my overview of the album. But I remember when I first heard this, I was in a clothing store in 1997 in Los Angeles, and it's funny, that's two videos in a row I've mentioned where I was in a clothing store and heard good music. There's a couple of different venues or places where you hear good music, and it's kind of expected that you'll hear like hit music or different music or dance music, and one of those was always like clothing stores. And when I used to DJ back in LA, I had a friend that worked at the fashion district, and those are some of the best places that I liked to DJ was, the fashion district, like at a clothing line launch party or just people, milling around and checking out new clothes. It was always a cool place where they kind of expected futuristic music and techno and electronic music. And so it was always cool to play there because I never got any like grief over why I'm playing what I'm playing back in those days in the 90s. And I remember I was going into, it was actually Pacific Sun, if you guys remember Pacific Sun, or it could have been Anchor Blue, but I think it was Pacific Sun or Pac Sun. It became Pac Sun. And I was in there, it was 1997, we'll never forget it. Heard this song, and it had a cool vocoder in it, and just very unique, and it sounded so European. And immediately it caught my attention, and I went up to the lady at the desk and was like, "What's playing?" And she was like, it's Air. It's this band called Air, and the song's called Sexy Boy. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. So I went to the record store probably sometime in the next week or two and bought Moon Safari, and here's my original CD. And I bought a vinyl copy sometime probably around 2009. And it's always been an album that I kind of gave to others who didn't really know electronic music. In fact, if you saw my CD, it's pretty scratched up from giving other people and letting them use it on their CD players over the year. It was kind of like one of my examples that I would give to people to kind of turn them on to some cool kind of down-tempo music that was cool enough for me because I was really into down-tempo music and I liked a lot of different styles, but sometimes my stuff was like too more techno and maybe too ambient or too this or that. But this one had vocals in it. This one had like unique instruments. It had real instruments in it, like from a tuba to a guitar to what have you. Just a lot of different unique kind of instruments in it, and it was really well rounded. But it was really classy. Also, it has like a little bit of a jazz element too, but it was very spacey and unique and very European sounding again. So this was an album I always kind of gave to people if they didn't know about electronic music. Like I'd give it to them as an example of what kind of the possibilities within electronic music and using cool instruments and things like that. It was a great example of that, and it always seemed to work well with people who didn't have a background in electronic music. If anything, they thought it was unique. Even if they didn't really love it, or they didn't think it was like, or they got too much in the production, or these are some really unique instruments, or I like the spacey feel. Like, if anything, they would be like, oh, this is kind of a interesting album, if anything. But in some ways, it's kind of like a soundtrack too, and so I always liked it from that perspective as well. But yeah, we're gonna play each song, and you'll hear the album in full. If you've never heard this album before, sit back and relax and enjoy it. If you have heard it, you'll see my scores above them as well. And feel free to rate the album along with me, track by track if you like, or just the overall of the album. I'd be curious to know your thoughts. If there's any album that you'd like me to review or a song, my email is down below. Feel free to message me, and I'd be curious to know what you're interested in me reviewing. Okay, let's check out Moon Safari. There's 10 tracks from 1998 on Astrowork Records. This is the band called Air.
Get behind the sun and cast his way. All I need's a place to find, and there I'll celebrate. All in all, there's something to give. Something to give. All in all, there's something to do. All in all, there's something to do. All in all, there's something to live. Away. You
so there we got a chance to check out each track from Moon Safari by Air from I almost said Air Supply from 1998, Astroworks Records. If you put yourself back in 1998, there was really nothing that sounded like this at the time. There was in the middle 90s, there was definitely some vintage sound, sort of from retro sounds. Every decade or so, sort of goes back to like disco or a certain period of time, and you think of like Daft Punk, which sort of did disco music, and there was they sort of helped lead the sort of disco retro sound in sort of blending that into like house music in the middle 90s. But you also, I guess, there was some 70s sort of feel in some of the 90s sound, but nobody quite did it in a way that Air did. Air did it in more of a spacey lounge feel, and doing it more like a 70s album than sort of just taking maybe the style of the 70s or the fashion or or just the more of the stereotypes of the genre and sort of putting into the new genre. Like Air was really, in my opinion, it was really, they were ahead of the curve as far as like doing a vintage sound that sort of put you in like another time and sort of did it in a new way. But there was really nothing that sounded like this. Like many were sort of going disco, but nobody was really doing like a spacey retro lounge sort of feel like this. Even though there was a lot of downtempo at the time, it was still sort of newer downtempo. I can only think of like Jimmy Tenor, from Warp Records, who really did a style that was similar to like Air, and but he had more of a rave aspect to it and sort of a jazz aspect than Air always felt like a soundtrack. Like if I was to like tie it to a soundtrack, it would sound like a soundtrack to like Moonraker by James Bond. Like it has a very classic 70s soundtrack movie feel. It's very cinematic, but then it's also very spacey and also a lot of unique sounds, so it's very futuristic at the same time. And it has sort of that, late 60s, early 70s spacey lounge feel. I think in some ways they were also very unique for the instruments that they were using. Like a lot of electronic bands were, for the most part, just using electronic music. Like they incorporated, some acoustic instruments, some horn instruments in there, like a Rhodes keyboard, a Moog, an organ, things like that. Like some of the percussion is very unique as well, and just all like became a big soup of unique sounding material. But even more so, I think it was more important that they used unique instruments. Was they sort of blended decades of sounds. Like they blended the 90s with the 70s in a strange way. And, just some excellent music in here throughout. Like you saw my scores, but a very consistent album. There's only one track in here that I rated, or I'm sorry, 2 of the 10 that I rated in the 6s. But I rated 5 tracks in the 8s, and then also an additional 3 tracks in the 7s. So just a very consistent, high-performing album. I think of the first song, just very gentle, how it comes in with the bass line and the percussion, and then you hear those keys, and it's such a great opener. Like when you hear La Femme d'Argent, it's one of those openers that makes you feel like, oh, we're listening to Moon Safari. Fantastic, because I love this album. Like it has that, immediately grabs you, and it's very synonymous with the rest of the record, in my opinion. But also the spacey sounds, again, the layering of the backing vocals. The track becomes very dreamlike. It's one of my favorites on the album, 8.25 stars. My favorite song on the album is probably, even though it's really hard because there's a lot of tracks that are so close. I have, 5 or 6 tracks within a point of each other, from in between 7.5 and 8.5. New Star in the Sky, track number 9, vocoder brilliance, like with the spacey vibes, and it almost sounds like a fireside chill out jamboree, like with Boy Scouts, like chilling out. You know, like instead of it being like a troop of Boy Scouts and sort of, you know, marshmallows, you're handing out J's and everybody's hanging out like by the fireside, just tripping out and hearing some great 70s, really melodic and really cool spacey music. Like that's what it's about. And you can see even from the artwork and stuff like that, they just nailed it on so many different levels. You know, with the flying V guitars doing space music and the mini Moogs. Like a lot of people in the middle 70s, they weren't using a lot of mini Moogs at the time. They kind of advanced, you know, and went into like newer keyboards. And I mean, this was like a breath of fresh air at the time when you hear the mini Moogs in here and amazing keyboards. And then there's some tracks with amazing vocals. All I Need, and then You Make It Easy with Beth Hirsch, who's also known for doing some songs with Averill and also D-Note, the classic Devotion track, which was a Cafe Del Mar chill out. Like she was featured on that, so I knew her from those already. I knew that from her. I knew Beth Hirsch from that song already in the 90s, but also she was later on the Averill album on FCOM Records, I believe. And yeah, I mean, You Make It Easy and All I Need, just excellent, kind of laid back, smooth tracks with a great vocal, some acoustic guitars in there, just fantastic. You know, I think the only maybe I'm not a big fan of maybe the last song. I think it's solid, but it's not fantastic. Kelly Watches the Stars, although I think is a very unique song, and it's a nice change of pace and really kind of wakes you up and kind of with such cool sounds in there. Some might say it's genius in a way because and I can see that, but for me, I think it's a preference thing. I give it 6.25 stars. I don't think it doesn't ruin the flow for me for anything, but in fact I think it works creatively with the album. But as a song by itself, it's a little fairly repetitive, but it's definitely catchy and still unique. But you know, I give it 6.25 stars. But those are the only two songs that I have in the sixes. Talisman is a really strong down tempo. I love the strings in it. You know, Seimentan La, really cool 70s feel. It gives me that kind of like that grocery store music sound. Like when I hear that like tuba sound and you know the background strings, it just feels like everything's all right in the world. It gives me like this memory of being like in a grocery store in the 70s and just, you know, such simpler times and such simpler life. Like that track and also Talisman, just, I mean, they just scream 70s vintage sound. And such a laid back album. And, you know, when I add up the stars for the album, it's even 75 divided by 10, which is a 7.5. So it's right there at a 75 out of 100. But considering the album and the flow and just the vibe of this, and it's an album that it's almost a crime not to play the album all the way through. Like, it's really hard to, like, you know, if you're DJing a set or you're playing some music and it comes on random and you play a song, sure, it's going to fit in great with what's going on if you're playing some down tempo. But if you put on an album, like, this is an album that you just turn off the lights to and just chill out to. And for that and for the artwork and for the vibe and being so unique at the time in the production, I gave the album an additional 5 stars and gave it an 80 out of 100. I think it screams classic of the genre. In many ways, I think if there was an album that was overlooked in the 80s as far as in popular music, although this album became fairly popular over time, I think if there was one album I would point to in the 80s, in the 90s, that should have got a Grammy, like, this would have been an album that should have got a Grammy. Like, the way it blended down-tempo and pop music and synth pop and, you know, in such a great way, it was just revolutionary for the time in many ways. But even more so than that, it's just very, very catchy music. But just an awesome album. And I would say for a 90s down-tempo album, how could you not say it isn't a classic? I don't think anybody would argue with me. In fact, I think some people would probably argue that it's probably closer to an all-time classic, probably closer to the 90s. I don't think anybody would probably argue with me that this album isn't at least a 75, if not an 80 or higher out of 100. Just an excellent album. It's hard to say anything negative about this album. Just a very enjoyable album. I think the only thing I can think of negatively about the band is they never even came remotely close to this album, even when I think of the soundtrack work they did, and even their sophomore album, just a hard album to possibly replicate or to top in some ways. So, in that respect, I don't blame them or blame that they couldn't top this in many respects, because it's a really unique album. I think even almost 30 years later, the album still sounds very unique in a lot of ways. Again, love the artwork as well. Curious to know what your thoughts are, your scores on each track, and then the scores of the overall album. If there's anything that you'd like me to review, my email's down below. Just shoot me a message, and I'd be curious to know what track or album that you would like me to review. All right, thanks so much, and we'll see you on the next video.